Imagine the most expensive warplane in human history flying over enemy territory. You can't see it on radar. You can't track it. You can't target it. It is, for all practical purposes, invisible. Now imagine that a country with less than 1/10 of the United States defense budget has spent the last 15 years building a specific system to destroy this plane, and that the engineers behind this system studied a flaw in physics that the architects of stealth themselves acknowledged decades ago and deliberately chose to ignore. This isn't science fiction. This isn't anti-American rhetoric. This is what defense analysts in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Moscow are confronting right now. Iran has built a 3-layered air defense system, anchored by low-frequency radars designed specifically to detect stealth aircraft. And the total cost of this system is a tiny fraction of the $1.7 trillion the United States invested in the F-35 program. Pay attention to this detail because this is where everything changes. There is a category of radar that stealth was never designed to defeat. Iran has been deploying this radar since 2009. And this isn't a recent development that came out of nowhere. It's the product of 2 decades of systematic study, indigenous development forced by sanctions, and a deliberate strategic decision to exploit the physics that the United States treated as a manageable risk. Throughout this video, we're going to dismantle this architecture layer by layer. We're going to explain the physics that stealth was never designed to defeat. We'll show how Iran learned from the defeats of others to build a system that is, in many ways, more robust because of the sanctions, not in spite of them. And we're going to reveal what an American airstrike against Iran would actually cost today in terms of planes, pilots, and strategic credibility. But before we get to the 3 layers, we need to understand the promise that is being broken. Because this isn't a story about a radar system. It's a story about the validity of a doctrine that cost over $2 trillion and shaped American foreign policy for 30 years. The F-22 Raptor, the F-35 Lightning II, the B-2 Spirit. These aren't just planes. They are symbols of a strategic gamble. The promise was simple and seductive. If the enemy can't see you, they can't shoot you. This premise justified every billion invested, every decision to modernize the American Air Force around stealth as its fundamental pillar. And this premise shaped decades of foreign policy. Because a superpower that can penetrate any airspace undetected operates with a freedom of action that no adversary can deny. Or so it was thought. But that premise ignored a structural flaw in wave physics. And Tehran has spent the last 15 years developing the exact tools to exploit it. To understand the vulnerability, we need to define what stealth actually is, because most people get the concept wrong. Stealth doesn't mean invisibility. It never did. What it means is a drastic reduction in radar cross-section, or RCS. A conventional combat aircraft without stealth treatment has an RCS comparable to a large bird of prey on a radar display. With RAM, radar-absorbent material, combined with a carefully calculated angular design that deflects signals away from the emitter, the RCS of an F-35 drops to something roughly the size of a golf ball. In some respects, even smaller. That is extraordinary, but it is frequency band specific. Modern fire control radars, the ones a missile system uses to guide a projectile to its target, operate primarily in the X-band and S-band, frequencies between 2 and 12 gigahertz. Stealth was designed precisely to defeat these radars. The surface geometries, the absorbent materials, the positioning of the engine inlets, everything was optimized for this frequency window. Inside this window, stealth works extraordinarily well. But there is another window, and in that window, stealth literally doesn't exist. Low-frequency radars in the VHF and UHF bands operate between 30 and 300 megahertz. When a radar's wavelength approaches the physical dimensions of an aircraft's surfaces, a phenomenon called resonance occurs. Instead of the signals being absorbed by the RAM coating or deflected by the angular surfaces, the aircraft's surface begins to re-radiate energy. The RAM coating, which costs tens of thousands of dollars per square meter, becomes effectively useless. The carefully calculated geometry no longer matters. To a VHF radar, an F-35 appears on the display not as a golf ball, but as a detectable object. Not with the resolution of a fire control radar, it's true, but detectable. And here is the detail that defense analysts have known since 1999, and that Washington treated as a managed risk for decades. Serbia shot down an F-117 Nighthawk using a radar from the 60s, a Soviet SA-3 Neva system, in a modified version operating on low-band frequencies. The F-117, the world's first operational stealth aircraft, costing $45 million, crashed over the Balkans on the night of March 27, 1999. The Serbian commander-in-charge, Zoltan Dani, later revealed that he monitored the F-117's flight pattern over weeks prior to the shootdown. He identified the moment the weapon bay doors opened during attacks, temporarily increasing the aircraft's RCS. He used this window of seconds to achieve a sufficient radar lock to launch 2 missiles, one of the most sophisticated aircraft of its time, brought down by tactical intelligence and basic wave physics. Iran studied this episode in detail and drew the right lesson. Physics doesn't negotiate. Stealth has a frequency limit. Below that limit, invisibility disappears. If this vulnerability has been known for decades, why did the United States continue betting trillions on stealth? The answer involves institutional inertia, industrial contracts, and the absence, until recently, of an adversary that actually invested in systematically exploiting this vulnerability. But Iran was paying attention, and the conclusions they drew would change their military doctrine. In 2007, strategists in Tehran were analyzing a clear pattern. They saw what happened to Iraq in 1991, to Serbia in 1999, to Afghanistan in 2001, to Iraq again in 2003, and then to Libya in 2011. In all these cases, the pattern was the same. An American air campaign would begin with SEADED, the suppression of enemy air defenses. Radars were destroyed with anti-radiation missiles that tracked the emission signals of the radars themselves. Command and control systems were neutralized in the initial phase. Once the airspace was clear, American aircraft operated with almost total impunity. Iranian analysts asked the right questions. What made these air defense systems vulnerable to American suppression? What were the tactical patterns American pilots followed in CAD campaigns? On what frequencies did Iraqi, Serbian, and Libyan radars emit, making them targets for HARM missiles? How was command and control structured, and how could it be degraded? At what time of day did stealth flights occur, and what were their route patterns? Every American campaign was a masterclass in strategy for Tehran. And then came a decision that would define decades. After 2007, Iran dramatically accelerated the development of indigenous air defense. International sanctions prevented purchases on the open market. Russia was under pressure not to supply the S-300, and the deal would take years to materialize. Iran was essentially on its own. There is a paradox that most Western analyses ignore. Sanctions did not weaken Iranian air defense. In critical aspects, they made it harder to suppress. By being forced to develop systems indigenously, Iran built a network that does not share the electronic signatures of the Soviet equipment the Americans spent decades learning to intercept and destroy. HARM missiles were programmed to track the emissions of specific Soviet radars. American CAD patterns were developed against known Soviet C-2 architectures. When Iran built its own systems, these patterns did not apply in the same way. Furthermore, indigenous development forced a culture of redundancy and survivability that purchased systems often lack. When you can't order a spare part from Russia, you design systems that can operate in a degraded state, that survive partial losses, that can be geographically dispersed, and that are difficult to neutralize with precision strikes against centralized nodes. Iran also did something few American adversaries have done systematically. It used open-source analysis, signal interception, and careful study of American operations to build a detailed model of how the United States conducts air suppression campaigns. Then it built its defense specifically to defeat that model. It is no coincidence that the Iranian system is geographically dispersed, that it doesn't rely on a single C2 node, and that it combines heterogeneous sensors that cannot be suppressed by a single type of attack. It's by design. The practical Iranian response was structured in 3 layers. But to understand why this model is so dangerous, we first need to examine the mathematics of redundancy. Imagine an air defense system with a kill probability of 70% per engagement. In isolation, that means 30% of targets get through. It's a significant failure rate. Now, layer 3 of those systems, where a target that escapes the first layer encounters the second, and one that escapes the second encounters the third. The probability of a target surviving all 3 layers is 0.3 multiplied by 0.3 multiplied by 0.3, less than 3%. A 3-layer architecture with individually imperfect systems creates a kill probability of over 97%. This is exactly the principle that structures Iranian air defense. The first layer is the long-range, high-altitude defense. The core system here is the S-300 PMU-2, supplied by Russia in 2016 after years of embargo. The S-300 has an engagement range of approximately 200 kilometers and was designed to strike high-value targets: strategic bombers, refueling aircraft, reconnaissance platforms, and cruise missiles. For any American air campaign planner, the S-300 represents an immediate problem. Eliminating the tankers and early warning platforms that sustain long-range operations means entering the S-300's envelope before suppressing it. But Russia isn't the heart of this first layer. The Bavar 373 is indigenously developed and introduced as operational in 2019. The Bavar 373 is Iran's answer to the S-300. Iran claims a range of 200 kilometers, and the ability to engage targets more maneuverable than the S-300 was originally designed to handle. The critical point isn't whether the Bavar is technically superior. It's that it exists, it's indigenously produced, it's not subject to Russian or Western embargoes, and it can be manufactured at scale within Iran. Sanctioning it won't stop it from operating. The second layer is medium-range, medium-altitude defense. This is the level where the system that should worry American planners the most operates. The Khordad-15. We'll detail its historical performance in June 2019 shortly. But what it represents in the context of the 3 layers is this. It's the engagement system for tactical aircraft, including stealth fighters that penetrate Iranian airspace and escape the first layer. The Khordad doesn't need to detect an F-35 at 300 kilometers on its own. It needs to engage it when it enters its operational envelope, coordinated with the first layer's sensors that have already detected and tracked the aircraft. The kill chain is distributed, not concentrated in a single system. The third layer is short-range, low-altitude defense. Systems like the Misug Manpads, the Shahab Thaqeb, and the Talish system form a dense terminal network that saturates the airspace at low altitudes. Why does this matter? Because one of the classic American tactical workarounds to navigate long-range SAM systems is low-altitude penetration. Flying nap of the Earth, under the radar horizon, using terrain to mask the signature. The Iranian third layer exists specifically to close off that escape route. There is no altitude window that evades all three layers simultaneously. The geographic distribution is equally decisive. These defenses aren't just clustered around Tehran, they stretch across the entire Iranian territory, with heavy concentrations around the nuclear sites at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, and along the likely approach routes of any air campaign coming from the Gulf or the East. An American planner can't just take out a SAM battery in Tehran and declare the path clear. Iranian airspace is defended in both geographic depth and layered depth. But all these missile systems are only as good as the eyes that feed them. And this is where Iranian investment in radar becomes decisive. The true technological leap, however, lies in the sensors, the counter-stealth radars that act as the eyes of the entire system. We start with the Ghadir, also known as Qadir. Operationally deployed since 2009, the Ghadir is a phased array radar operating in the VHF band. This is no accident. It was explicitly designed to detect low RCS targets, exploiting the exact resonance phenomenon we discussed. The Ghadir represents Iran's first doctrinal and technological decision to build a specific capability against American stealth aircraft, more than a decade ago. Western analysts often cite a real limitation of the Ghadir: poor angular resolution. VHF radars are excellent for detecting that a target exists, but they lack the precision needed to guide a missile to that target with kinetic accuracy. This is true, but it's irrelevant to the layered architecture for the following reason. The Ghadir's role isn't to guide a missile. The Ghadir's role is to tell the rest of the system. There is an aircraft here, at this approximate altitude, on this approach vector. From that initial handoff, the medium-range fire control radars, which already know where to look, acquire the target much faster. The kill chain doesn't need a single sensor to do everything. It needs specialized sensors feeding each other. Now we zoom out to the CPIR. Unveiled around 2020, the CPIR is an OTH, over-the-horizon radar, with a stated range of 3,000 kilometers. Over-the-horizon radars work through ionospheric reflection. Radio signals are sent upward, bounce off the ionosphere, and return to Earth at massive distances. The CPIR is not an engagement radar. It is an ultra-long-range early warning radar, capable of detecting the launch of strategic bombers from American bases in the Indian Ocean or the Persian Gulf, with far more lead time than any conventional system would allow. But the most profound revelation in this section isn't the Ghadir or the CPIR. It's passive radar. Stealth works by absorbing or deflecting active radar signals, but passive radar doesn't transmit, ever. Instead of emitting a signal and waiting for the return, passive radar uses other emission sources, like commercial radio broadcasts or television signals, as sources of illumination, and analyzes how those signals reflect off passing objects. Or, more directly, it uses the emissions of the target aircraft itself as the detection signal. Think about this philosophical inversion. Stealth was designed to hide the aircraft from radar by making it transparent to active radar transmissions. Passive radar transmits nothing. There is no transmission to be absorbed by RAM. There is no beam to be deflected by angled surfaces. Passive radar detects the aircraft through its own emissions. Communication systems, radar altimeters, data links. The aircraft that was supposed to be invisible becomes visible because of its own transmissions. Satellite imagery doesn't lie. Aircraft electronic signatures don't either. There's also the IRST, infrared search and track. Jet engines generate immense heat. At lower altitudes, where the atmosphere is denser, the thermal signature of an F-35 or F-22 creates a detectable infrared trail that has absolutely nothing to do with radar cross-section. It is a completely separate dimension of detection entirely immune to the concept of stealth. And then there's the layer of data fusion. The Iranian system's ability to integrate information from the Ghadir, the Seper, passive systems, the IRST, and fire control radars into a common aerial picture. These aren't isolated batteries making independent decisions. It's a network of heterogeneous sensors feeding into a unified operational picture, where each sensor covers the limitations of the others. The kill chain works like this. The Ghadir detects a low RCS aircraft at 200 kilometers. The VHF detection is imprecise, but sufficient to alert the system and indicate the approximate direction. The medium-range fire control radar, knowing where to look, acquires the target at 60 or 70 kilometers. The Khordad system engages. What no individual sensor could do, the network does collectively. Passive radar, in theory, completely defeats the concept of stealth. But has this actually been proven in practice? That's the question the upcoming events will answer. All of this would just be theory if it hadn't been tested. But there are concrete events demonstrating what this network is capable of doing under combat conditions against real American assets. June 20th, 2019. The American RQ-4A Global Hawk surveillance drone is flying over the Strait of Hormuz. The Global Hawk is the most sophisticated high-altitude ISR system in the world, costing $222 million per unit. It flies at a cruising altitude above 18,000 meters, far beyond the operational envelope of most conventional SAM systems. It's not a stealth aircraft, but it represents the gold standard in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. The Iranian Khordad 15 system shot it down with a single missile. The issue that matters isn't the immediate operational loss. The real question is what this reveals about Iranian sensor coverage. For the Khordad to bring it down, Iranian sensors needed sufficient detection, tracking, and signal quality to guide a missile to an altitude above 18 kilometers. That is a real, demonstrated capability, not just a claim in a press release. And now comes the central piece of the puzzle. If a $222 million drone cannot survive over Iranian airspace, what does that imply for a $100 million F-35 that flies faster and higher, but actually needs to penetrate that same airspace to strike targets? January 8, 2020. In response to the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, Iran launches a ballistic missile attack against the Al-Asad airbase in Iraq, where American troops were stationed. The result was 22 American service members left with traumatic brain injuries. The Iranian missiles impacted specific targets within the base with a precision that surprised American analysts. This was not an area attack. It was a demonstration of precise, real-time targeting intelligence against a fortified American installation. April 2024. Operation True Promise E. For the first time in history, Iran strikes Israeli territory directly with approximately 185 drones, 110 ballistic missiles, and 36 cruise missiles. Over 330 projectiles in total. Israel, with American, British, and Jordanian support, intercepted the vast majority. The Israeli defense systems worked, but the cost of interception was extraordinary. Every Patriot interceptor, every Arrow 3, represents millions of dollars in investment fired against low-cost drones and medium-range missiles. The economic exchange ratio dramatically favors the attacker. October 2024. Operation True Promise Tiho. 2. A different doctrine from the first. Not saturation, but precision. Approximately 200 ballistic missiles, focused, with trajectories designed to saturate specific points in the Israeli defense. What changed between the two operations was the incorporation of tactical data gathered during the first one, a capability for learning and adapting in operational time. Also in October 2024, the Israeli counterattack in Iran. Israel struck targets inside Iranian territory, and reports indicated damage to at least one radar node of the S-300 system. This is relevant because it demonstrates that the Iranian defense is not invulnerable. Systems can be suppressed. Radars can be destroyed. But a destroyed S-300 node within an architecture that includes the Bavar 373, the Ghadir, the Seper, the Khordad 15, and all the low-altitude systems does not represent the collapse of the system. It represents exactly the kind of loss that the redundancy architecture was designed to absorb and survive. The cumulative picture is clear. Iran has demonstrated high-altitude detection, targeting precision against hardened American bases, and mass-scale launch capability with doctrinal adaptation between operations. Every event adds a data point to the same conclusion. The system is not theoretical. It is operational. The impact of all this on American military planning is profound. This is the point where technical capability translates into immediate strategic consequence. Any American air campaign against Iran, whether targeting the nuclear infrastructure at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, or broader military capabilities, must necessarily begin with SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses. There is no other way. You cannot launch strike aircraft against protected Iranian targets while the Bavar 373 and the Khordad 15 are operational. First, you have to suppress or destroy them. This requires a large-scale CID campaign, with aircraft launching anti-radiation missiles, intensive electronic jamming, and strikes on command and control nodes. And every CID mission requires aircraft, fuel, aerial tankers, ISR surveillance, and time. Each CID mission means exposing yourself to the very system you're trying to destroy, before the real work even begins. This is the brutal math that American planners have to face. An F-22 Raptor costs roughly $150 million. A B-2 Spirit costs $2.1 billion, and there are only 21 of them in the world. A medium-range Iranian SAM missile costs a mere fraction of that. If the Iranian system manages to shoot down a single B-2, the cost of that missile has paid for itself hundreds of times over. And the B-2 cannot be replaced within any meaningful time frame. The production line no longer exists. The exchange ratio between attackers and defenders is catastrophically unfavorable for the United States when the adversary has low-cost systems capable enough to engage high-cost platforms. They don't need to shoot down every American plane. They just need to make the operation expensive enough to be politically unsustainable. Losing 3 to 5 stealth aircraft in a single campaign, whether F-22s or B-2s, wouldn't just be a tactical event. It would be a strategic and political earthquake. The U.S. Congress would hold hearings. International media would broadcast every image of the wreckage. The narrative of American invincibility, a core component of its deterrence, would publicly collapse in real time. Iran understands this. Iranian doctrine isn't designed to militarily defeat the United States in a symmetrical war. It's designed to impose costs that cross the political threshold of tolerance. Then, there's the geographical problem. Fordo is buried over 80 meters underground in solid rock. Natanz is deeply entrenched. Reaching these targets requires deep penetration into Iranian airspace, flying through multiple layers of defense, with aircraft that must carry munitions heavy enough to pierce hardened underground facilities. After every strike, the question American commanders would face is, how much was actually destroyed? The answer, in most plausible scenarios, is not enough to justify the cost. Compare that to Iraq in 1991. The Iraqi air defense was massive in numbers, but centralized, technologically outdated, and lacked the integration of heterogeneous sensors. The Gulf paradigm does not translate to Iran. Analysts who use 1991 as a baseline are extrapolating from the wrong adversary for the wrong threat at a completely different time. This brings us to the final question. What does this mean for the future of aerial warfare? Iran is not alone in this development. That is exactly what makes the Iranian case so significant for Western planners. It validates an approach that much more powerful adversaries are replicating on a far grander scale. Russia has deployed the S-400 and is developing the S-500, boasting claimed counter-stealth capabilities that go well beyond the S-300. China has developed the HQ-9 and is advancing with the HQ-19, alongside parallel investments in VHF counter-stealth radars. Iran has proven that the approach works. Moscow and Beijing are taking notes. What can the United States do? There are three paths of response currently in development. The first is advanced electronic warfare, more sophisticated jamming systems capable of suppressing heterogeneous sensor networks instead of just individual radars. The second involves long-range hypersonic weapons, which allow strikes on targets from outside the IAD's engagement envelope without ever penetrating defended airspace. The third is directed energy lasers and high-power microwave systems that could enable much lower-cost interceptions. None of these paths solve the problem in the short term. The B-21 Raider, America's next-generation stealth bomber, is an evolution of the B-2 with a reduced signature and improved survivability systems. But the B-21 remains a stealth bomber primarily designed to operate within specific frequency bands. How it performs against next-generation VHF radars remains an open, publicly unanswered question. The concept emerging in planning circles is that of contested airspace, replacing the premise that stealth guarantees freedom of action with the harsh reality that entering certain airspaces requires accepting risks and costs that simply didn't exist a generation ago. For American bases in the Middle East, Diego Garcia, Al Udeid, Al Dhafra, the problem is compounded. They are all within range of Iranian ballistic missiles. This means that any air operation launched from these bases must survive not only the IADs, but also the missile threat directed at the launch bases themselves. Stealth is not dead. It is still a real advantage in multiple conflict scenarios where the adversary hasn't specifically invested in low-frequency countermeasures. But it is no longer an absolute trump card. It is no longer the guarantee that was sold to the U.S. Congress for 3 decades. Iran spent a fraction of the F-35 program's $1.7 trillion identifying the frequency limit of stealth, building radars to exploit that limit, integrating these radars into a 3-tiered architecture designed to impose unacceptable costs on any air force attempting to operate in its airspace, and operationally demonstrating that the system works. The era of flying stealthily without facing consequences seems to be over for Iranian airspace. And the doctrine that Iran pioneered is spreading to adversaries with much larger budgets. Stealth is an illusion when physics says otherwise. And physics, as Iran has demonstrated with hard data, doesn't negotiate. If this video changed how you view stealth technology and the balance of air power, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. In upcoming videos, we'll analyze what the Russian S-400 and S-500 mean for NATO's plans in Europe, and whether the American B-21 is truly the answer the Pentagon promises it to be. The conversation about the future of air superiority is just beginning.